Joining us today is Ben Nelson, the founder of the Minerva Project and Minerva University.
Universities could use an upgrade. For one, they're too expensive. Most are old-fashioned.
That's right.
And according to this guy, they don't even educate that well.
Welcome. My name is Daniel Gerlay, and I'm the president of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society, an international organization supporting exceptional young people in accomplishing their entrepreneurial ambitions. Co-hosting the interview with me today is Lewis Swire, the director of GYES's UK operations and the editor-in-chief of the Curious Times.
Just think about it. If any of us were to be presented with a final exam that we got an A on in college today, we would all flunk it. Educational institutions certify short-term memory, but they don't actually certify education.
So he created a new type of university that's harder to get into than Harvard.
Ben is a visionary entrepreneur with the aim of transforming higher education. Ben established Minerva University in 2012 using $25 million in venture capital financing from Benchmark Capital. Students learn an innovative curriculum for proprietary video conferencing software while living in 7 different cities around the world over the course of a 4-year bachelor's degree. Minerva is recognized as the most competitive university in the world with a 1% acceptance rate, which is lower than Harvard. Before founding Minerva, Ben helped build and eventually became the CEO of a startup called Snapfish, where he helped build the company from a startup to the world's largest personal publishing service. We are very pleased to welcome Ben Nelson.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on. What motivated you to leave Snapfish and start Minerva as a new venture in the education sector?
Well, one actually had nothing to do with the other. I was at Snapfish more than 10 years altogether, and we had been acquired by Hewlett-Packard, and I ran Snapfish for a number of years as part of HP. There was a period of time where I realized, hey, I wanted to, finish that chapter of my career. And I spent about 18 months figuring out how to do my transition. About more than 12 months of those, nobody knew that I was thinking about my transition, but I was laying the groundwork for it. And then eventually announced it, and I had my successor and kind of had everything in place. And so between the time when I announced my departure, which was April of 2010, when I actually left, which was June of 2010, I did start thinking about, okay, well, what am I going to do next? Because I didn't have a plan. And that's when the concept of Minerva kind of began to crystallize.
What opportunity or failing in the education sector did you identify for the Minerva project?
Outside of the fact that the education sector doesn't educate, and outside of the fact that when it doesn't educate and it certifies that somebody knows something, it certifies it for not exactly the most meritocratic students, and it does so at enormous societal cost, and does so on, even if it did educate and even students to actually learn, universities teach almost exclusively the wrong approach to knowledge to begin with. Outside of that, nothing. So everything else is fine. But of course, that fundamental issue is that the higher education sector around the world is, especially at the undergraduate level, really serves very poorly serves its intention. It is built really on a world where access to information was scarce. And it is just grounded in this perspective that in order to acquire information, you need to be in a physical campus-based environment with a group of people listening to somebody talk at you. You have to remember that the concept of the university, the structure of the university, was formed before the printing press. And so, yes, at that time, that was by far the most effective way of getting information, to actually get you written material was so time consuming and so error prone that it was much, much better to sit around and listen to somebody talk, because you really didn't have access to information otherwise. But to this day, if you look at the generic mission statement of a university, it is to create research and disseminate information. That is the or knowledge, or depending on the variant. But that is at its core what a university thinks it is for. And that is unfortunately not what is necessary. Now, creation of knowledge is always useful, and research, when it's done well, is good. Unfortunately, the vast majority of university-generated research is completely and utterly useless, but you have to, waste a lot of time in order to find gems. So that may be an okay model. But the dissemination aspect of it, frankly, universities are completely unnecessary for the dissemination of knowledge. And that is really the core problem, which is universities kind of intellectually know that. They speak, we teach our students to think critically, and we teach them to solve problems creatively and all the rest. But when you look at what the university actually does, disseminates knowledge. And that's kind of the fundamental problem.
And for our viewers who are less familiar with what you're doing with Minerva, how can you explain that you're countering this and that you are solving the problem that you just identified?
The core way to understand Minerva and our entire educational philosophy, and what we believe is education as opposed to what people think of as education, is that when we generally approach the concept of educating somebody outside of a Minerva context, the idea is, can I verify at a certain period of time that you can recall something? Right. Or at best, demonstrate that you can apply it in the context in which you were taught it, right? So you would take a course on astrophysics, you would be, saying in a test, hey, can you recall principles of astrophysics? Or at best, can you apply the principles you learn in physics in the context of astrophysics? That's lovely. The only problem is that period of time assessment is proven scientifically to be an ineffective measure of actual learning. So you can take the same set of students, the same exam, and and administer that same exam. Maybe you change some of the questions to, in case they, but you frankly don't really need to do that, and administer it 6 months later. And students that have, gotten correct answers across the board will be able to retain 5 to 10% of what they tested on correctly 6 months before. And so the issue, the fundamental issue, is that students are simply not retaining, right? They're cramming for the exam, they're passing the exam, and they're forgetting everything that was on the exam. So not only is that an issue in retention, it's also an issue in the concept of education, because education is not about cramming yourself with information, having you be able to draw it out when you encounter it in the same way that you were taught in class, because we live in a variable world. We live in a complex world. We live in a world that does move incredibly faster and in more diverse sense than the world we're used to, right? So if you think about the history of humanity, much of our history has been living in the context that we're familiar with. We were born a farmer, you died a farmer. Right? You were born in a village, in a clan, you died with that village or clan, right? Maybe you had a neighboring clan or village, maybe you were fighting a little bit, but the world that you knew was pretty much the world as it was. And every once in a while, we'd have some invading force that would come in and change some of the rules of the game. But rarely was that invading force. Sometimes in human history, you didn't know that they even existed, but usually the context of your life was very similar. Today, from one day to the next, what you do, what you encounter, your career, where you are, can change dramatically. And because of that, the idea of being able to take what you've learned and apply it in a different context is really what's crucial. And fundamentally, that is actually what education is. Education doesn't end with some certification of short-term recall of knowledge. It begins with acquisition of knowledge. And it actually ends when you're able to apply that knowledge in whatever context you encounter. That concept is referred to as far transfer by psychologists. Colloquially, it's known as wisdom, knowing what to do in a situation you've never encountered before, right? That's all wisdom is. And because of that, the nature of an educational enterprise, and this is what we've innovated and created at Minerva, is about taking a student and not only providing them an opportunity to acquire knowledge, great, that's the beginning. They begin their Minerva journey by acquiring knowledge, and in every course they ingest knowledge that they need. But then everything about a Minerva education is about the broad application of that knowledge over and over and over and over again. And that's actually the key innovation around what a Minerva education is. And that's why we have the historical graduate outcomes that we have. That's why we create such great results for our students, because our students do attain a level of analytical wisdom that not only is not available to graduates of other institutions, it's not available to most professionals and working adults. And that really is the unique aspect. And so as we designed our own universities, we work with other universities to implement Minerva programs. That's the big revolution in the approach to education.
When you left Snapfish to start Minerva, what was your game plan to start a new university?
The game plan was actually an even bigger game plan than just launching the university. The game plan was how to reform global higher education. And so at a high level, if you want to reform global higher education, all higher education reform movements over the last 200 years were top-down. Elite institutions either did something or were created in a different way. Other institutions said, oh my God, the elites are doing something different, or an elite institution is doing something different. Let's follow in their footsteps. This is everything from the introduction of examinations by Oxford and Cambridge in the 1810s and 20s to having exit exams and literacy requirements by Harvard in the middle of the 19th century, the introduction of the German Research University model into the United States by Johns Hopkins, and eventually Harvard right after in the late 1800s, 1870s, and then 1880s for Harvard. The abandonment of curricula in the 1960s by Brown and Berkeley, and everything follows. Even the MOOC craze, right, started at Stanford and then quickly followed by Harvard and MIT. And even though online courses existed for decades, all of a sudden the entire higher education industry lost its mind. Everybody was doing MOOCs. No one knew why. To this day, no one knows what MOOCs are for and why people are using them or should use them. It's an absolute mania. And that was the insight. The insight was, if you want to have systematic higher education reform, you've got to effectively come at it from the top. And I wasn't going to be able to just waltz into an Ivy League university and say, hey, why don't you change your fundamental approach to education? I actually tried that as an undergraduate, didn't work. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to hijack it. I'm going to parachute in from the top. I'm going to create a brand new institution. It'll look down at elite institutions as second rate, and it'll establish a new concept of what an elite institution can be. And then once that institution is established, then it will be able to have that knock-on effect and reform the rest of higher ed. And the core insight around how to tap into that dynamic is that the number of seats in elite American higher education roughly grew with the proportion of the eligible population. In fact, one could argue grew faster than the proportion of the eligible population from the late 19th century until the late 20th century. So there were more and more elite institutions that were opening up. There were more seats at those institutions. For example, my alma mater went from an incoming class in 1880 of about 70 students to an incoming class in 1990 of about 2,500, right? So huge expansion of the number of seats in Ivy League universities and their kind. But then, beginning in 1990, the growth of the incoming class halted. And so by the time I started Minerva, which was 30 years later in 2010, 11, when I started working on it, a number of seats available in American higher education between 1990 and 2010 was basically the same. Now, forget general population growth. I mean, the United States grew as a country over those 30 years. But in 1990, universities were largely, at least admitted to largely being economically exclusionary. They were there only for, upper middle class and wealthy students. Whereas during the 1990s, the universities started talking about, being financially inclusive, even though they claim to be need blind. They're not, but they claim to be more open to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that aperture increases the qualified student body by 5x, right? So huge increase, a bigger increase than including women, right? Because many of these institutions were only focused on men. When they included women, the aperture grows by 2x, right? And so huge delta. And then, of course, on top of that, the world in 1990, 1989 was radically different than the world in 2010, right? The Berlin Wall only fell in 1989. China and India didn't liberalize their economies until 1991. The global middle class, which was practically, in statistical irrelevance in the late 1980s, was enormously large in 10 years ago and growing larger. Economic and social mobility was sweeping the entire world. And so when you look at that perspective, the demand that comes from outside the United States, and in fact, many students from all over the world wanted to get an American education, especially a highly branded one. And so demand was actually 50x bigger than supply. And that was the aha moment. The aha moment was you can start a brand new elite university by addressing a population which has been fundamentally excluded by the elite simply because they just don't have the capacity, right? And therefore, you can create something that flies in at the top, which is, by the way, much easier than starting at the bottom and trying to inch your way up, as some other institutions are trying to do, despite the fact that the dynamics could allow them to do that. So that was the aha moment, which is I can tap a population that is as high potential, if not higher, than a typical incoming Ivy League class. If I actually deliver a good educational model for them, they're going to come out better than a graduating Ivy League class. And I will align the brand of the institution with student outcomes, right? And so long as I can demonstrate, hey, our outcomes are superior to the outcomes of the incumbents, then I can plausibly not only back up the claim of being the best university in the world, but I could prove it. And as soon as you do that, then you have the ability to go out and inspire others to change as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, your approach is evidently really works and it's incredibly successful. But would you not say that educational reform needs to start from the ground up? So like kindergarten, nursery, and it's changes in that era, then primary school, secondary school, then you get to higher education. Because otherwise you're getting loads of people and then they're arriving at higher education in a completely changing system. And they've just wasted, I don't know, 18 years of their life in an education system that doesn't serve them.
That's right. And that is realistically what the world has always been trying to do. If you look at education reform organizations of any kind, there are a ton in kindergarten, and there's a large number in elementary school, and there's a decent number in middle school, and there's some in high school. And in higher education, they're non-existent. There is no education. I mean, we're the only organization I know of that is focused on curricular and pedagogical reform in the higher education sector anywhere in the world. But the problem is that it actually works our way. Right? Think about the high school system that we have. So just think about like the step before college. Do you think high schools determine what high school systems are? No, right? The American school system was designed, basically dictated by the president of Harvard in the late 19th century, Charles Eliot. He was the chair of the Committee of 10, which was really the Committee of One, him. And he said, hey, American high schools are too much variability and I don't like it and I don't know what I'm getting. So you will do this now. And to this day, there is a standard called the University of California A through G standard. And every year, the University of California publishes a list of courses that if you want to be able to get into the UC system, your high school has to offer, right? And so if the UC A through G system decides unilaterally, hey, you know what? The vast majority of our students don't need calculus. This is kind of a silly, esoteric type of subject area, certainly not taught well in high schools, but boy, every single student needs to understand probability and statistics. And so, in order to get into the UC system, you must have a statistics class. That must be a requirement. Every high school in the United States, if not the world, by the next year will have a statistics course, right? They have no choice, right? They have to, right? Think about the British Empire, right? Or the former British Empire, right? The requirements dictated to high schools were dictated by one institution, Cambridge University, the Cambridge A-levels, right? Cambridge A-levels are owned by the Cambridge University. They determine what it is, what are the requirements to get into college, and what do 8 million test takers a year do? Whatever Cambridge tells them to do, right? And then you can think back, well, what does middle school do? Well, middle school, right? I mean, when you want to take an A level, you got to study for your IGCSEs, right? And that's how it goes. And then you think about like, oh, okay, well then what do I need to do in elementary school, right? And so it actually all trickles down. It doesn't go bottoms up. And so you're right that it is a system. You need to address the system step by step, but you actually have to start in higher ed in order, if you want to have any chance of influencing the steps down. And by the way, we've already begun laying the groundwork for that, in that we've built a high school curriculum, which we hope will be the new Cambridge A-level. It's called the Minerva Baccalaureate. And the Minerva Baccalaureate, again, same thing. It moves away from the A-level, advanced placement, IB, teach to a test, atomized subjects that have nothing to do with anything else you study, and is instead an integrated, multidimensional, transfer-grounded education. And we believe that'll have kind of profound impacts moving down.
How did you raise funding and build your team for the Minerva project?
The funding was not trivial, because you're right. It wasn't, there is no playbook in Silicon Valley that says create company, raise $100 million, give it away to charity, and then start a business 10 years later. Though that was our business plan. And the idea behind it was that, first, higher education is a long game, right? There's just no way around it, right? Just to build a university, you've got to build the infrastructure and the curriculum, then you got to hire the right people, then you got to go out and find the students, and then you matriculate them, and then 4 years later you graduate them. I mean, so that's the proof point, and you got to rinse and repeat and get better and better, and then you can start influencing others. So it's a very, very long process. And it's true that a nonprofit is better set up for a long-term approach because investors have a certain horizon by which they want to get their return on investment. The problem with a nonprofit model is twofold. Number one, it is really beholden to the donor. Nonprofit is not really react to market forces. And therefore, when you have a large number or a large quantum of the funds that are necessary coming in from donors, they have a disproportionate say on what it is that you do or don't do. And that's quite buffeted in a for-profit enterprise where, yes, you have investors that have an opinion, but ultimately it is the market and the business plan that dictates what it is that you're going to do. The second is talent acquisition. The fact of the matter is that talent is overwhelmingly located within for-profit organizations. You can compensate better, you can align incentives better, you can actually provide a pathway to significant return. And therefore, if you, as we needed to build a technology, needed to have a sophisticated marketing and sales operation, those things are just not possible, or at least very, very hard to make possible in a nonprofit context. I mean, so for example, think about what technology do you use day to day that is built, marketed, and serviced by nonprofits? You're kind of hard pressed, right? It's very, very challenging to create that. So that was the theory that I could at least create a corporation that would build the basis of intellectual property, propagate it, make it valuable, and then be able to capitalize it over time. Having said that, to find investors that had that long-term vision was very hard, very, very hard, because they're very few and far between. And we were just very lucky to be able to create that constellation. And there is a reason, I often say this, in San Francisco, there are 3 Airbnbs for dogs. There's only one Minerva. There's only one Minerva anywhere in the world. Because we don't fit into the typical funding structure that exists for corporations. It's a great opportunity because we have a horizon that other institutions of other companies were not able to have, but it is challenging when it comes to raising funds.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You keep mentioning that Minerva doesn't fit into the normal mold, not just for funding, but also against like Ivy League universities and Oxford, Cambridge. So how did you deal with competition, if there is competition, within the higher education space?
Yeah, we dealt with substitution, not competition, right? So to this day, Minerva doesn't really have a direct competitor, right? It has substitutes, right? And so those substitutes are, you can, if you're an undergraduate and you want to go to university, you can decide to go to Minerva University. You can decide to go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are competitors with one another. They offer basically the same exact product, the same experience, the same everything. They cost the same. The majors are exactly the same. The dorms the same. They're triplets. They're identical. They just happen to be in slightly different locations in the Northeast of the United States. But when your entire competitive set is Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they look different. When your competitive set is Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Minerva, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are indistinguishable from one another. They're, generic, basic institutions that, take a lot of money and offer practically nothing in return, right? And so the nature of what Minerva provides is so different, despite the fact that, yes, you can substitute it. At the end of the day, you get a bachelor's degree. Sorry. So that's the key difference. The key difference is that you're able to differentiate, or we were able to differentiate what we were doing to such an extent that, of course, anybody can decide to spend, hey, I'm going to spend 4 years doing something different, but the competitive landscape is very different. It's also very similar when we go to work with other universities. Another university isn't going to say, oh, am I going to launch a Minerva program or going to launch a Stanford program? Stanford doesn't let you launch a Stanford program. That's not an offering that a university does, right? And so the nature of that is really quite different. And so now a university can decide, hey, I'm going to go and, I don't know, take a program that I'm already thinking of as an institution and launch that, right? So they can substitute a Minerva program for an ingrown program, or work with some other third-party provider to take one of their existing programs and get more students enrolled in it, or what have you. But nobody shows up to a university and says, hey, what you're doing isn't really working, so you should adopt a different approach and we'll help you create a new program using this philosophy. It's kind of our own thing. And that's what makes it an opportunity to do something that's fundamentally not in competition.
How is the Minerva organization structured?
Now, so it used to be that the company ran the university when it was incubated within an existing university. We had to incubate the university within one of the existing Claremont colleges called KGI, because that was the only way to get an accredited degree for our very first students. But ever since July of 2021, which is when we were granted our standalone official accreditation on our own, we spun out of KGI. Minerva became a standalone nonprofit university at that point. And that institution has its own board, it has its own management team, has its own employees, its own faculty, its own staff, many of whom, of course, used to work at the corporation, but were transferred into the nonprofit when it came time to be independent. And the Minerva Project, the organization that owns all the intellectual property, the curriculum, the teaching methodologies, the technology, the Minerva brand, we have our own board of directors and management structure and employee base. And so there are really two institutions. The Minerva Project created Minerva University, but Minerva University now operates independently. And now the Minerva Project works with other institutions to launch new programs that are designed by Minerva.
Will future intellectual property or research generated by Minerva University still be the property of the Minerva Project?
Depends where the funding for it comes from. So any modifications to the intellectual property that we created in the corporation is owned by the corporation. But for example, if the university decides to start a new program or something, it'll be jointly owned by the corporation and the university.
What is the core product or service offering of the Minerva Project?
Yeah, that's right. So we basically offer two kinds of services that are part of a larger implementation for our partners. So we first and foremost help design bespoke programs for our partners. So it could be undergraduate programs, it could be executive education, professional learning, it could be graduate degrees, it could even be high school curricula that we design for our partners. And then we implement them, right, using Forum and training their professors, giving them support in order to be able to deliver the kinds of Minerva programs that we've designed. So that's really how you engage with us. And it's actually quite similar to typical enterprise software type of approaches, except our software isn't just a technology, it's a curriculum, lesson plans, et cetera, right? So for example, if you were to get a Salesforce instance, and you would use Salesforce in your company, right? You would hire a group of consultants to design the Salesforce instance, to do the implementation, and then you would actually buy the licenses to allow your employees to use Salesforce and pay support to provide support for them. So it's actually a pretty standard enterprise model.
In your opinion, what makes a great leader?
There's not a formula, but certainly what we focus on at Minerva when we create great leaders is to focus on systematic thinking. A leader, and again, wisdom. A leader is called upon to make decisions and to be able to carry with them an organization in situations that no one has encountered before. Again, if you encountered something before and you know what to do, that's memory, right? And that doesn't really require leadership. It's much more, okay, well, when this happens, do this. And that doesn't really require great leadership. But real leadership occurs when you're at a point which is unfamiliar. You don't know what to do next, but you can apply systems of thinking to create a most plausible path to success. And you can then communicate and inspire the rest of your team to go down that pathway with you. To me, that is the core of what great leadership is all about. It is the ability to navigate uncharted territory and do so while bringing an organization along with you successfully.
You are an incredibly successful entrepreneur. What are some of the tools you use to manage your time and energy?
I don't know how successful an entrepreneur I am, but I've certainly demonstrated some luck in the past. I do have one investor who tells everyone they meet, Ben is the best CEO that we have in our portfolio because he always answers his email. And that's, I find it to be a backhanded compliment. But there's something that's kind of interesting about that insight, which is there is a fetish among entrepreneurs and among executives in general about being busy, right? It's almost like a sign of you being in demand. It's a demonstration that oh my God, this person has got to be valuable because they have no time for anything. And if you want to talk to them, you have to book 7-8 months in advance. And that is certainly true for some. And there are certainly periods of time when, I look at my schedule and I'm starting at 6 a.m. and I'm ending at 11 at night, and I have very little breaks in between because it's busy, right? The busy times. Having said that, it's also when you kind of look at it dispassionately and you say, well, am I actually necessary in every one of those meetings? Do I really need? Is that the best leveraging of my time to be able to do that? Versus, hey, do I have an organization that I'm empowering to do 80% of this stuff? And now all of a sudden, I have time to meet people I wouldn't have normally met before, take random conversations. I don't know where they will lead, but maybe will lead somewhere interesting, right? Or provide or send out a message, conduct an interview that wouldn't normally conduct, but may actually have knock-on effects later on, right? And that is, I think, one of the great opportunities for an entrepreneur, because again, you don't know where opportunity will come in. Now, it doesn't mean you say yes to everything. You have to be discerning. You've got to make sure that your time is well spent. Otherwise, you then do become completely busy and have no time for anything. But it enables you to, but if you make sure that you have periods of free time where you can respond and you can be open to new opportunities, it allows you to meet people, to enter into conversations, to find potential customers or partners that otherwise you wouldn't. And so to me, that's been one of the key areas that I think have made me successful, which is I try to be in places and meet people, even if I'm not exactly sure what I'm meeting them for, but because I think there may be an opportunity to build on something. And you kiss a lot of frogs and there's a bunch of wastes of time, but you get better at being able to determine upfront, yeah, this maybe is something that will be worthwhile versus, well, it's likely going to be something where I'm not going to be able to be helpful to that person. That person's probably not going to be able to be helpful for me. And so there's really no point in engaging.
Well, I'm mentioning that you're talking a lot about time management, and what's your view on work-life balance?
Yeah, it's a fiction. So look, there is a leadership position is an explicit taking on of responsibility, right? So when you run an organization, you are responsible ultimately for your employees, for your customers, for your investors, right? For stewardship of the organization overall. And that responsibility is not one which you can abdicate, right? So it's not one of these things where, hey, your company or your organization, needs you to do something, and you can say, well, I'd rather not, right? I'm busy. I gotta meditate now. Because boy, after like spending 2 hours like taking care of myself, I'm going to be that much more productive in taking care of the company. Maybe that's true for some people. I don't really see it, because ultimately, and this is actually, again, one of the reasons why you want to be able to effectively delegate, why you want to have free time, because your time is really not your own when you run an organization. It is dictated by your employees, your customers, potential partners, by your investors, et cetera. And it is not that straightforward to be able to have that type of dynamic where you have an ecosystem of institutions and individuals that require your attention, and you have to, and you can balance that out. Now, on top of that, another major part of responsibility is the responsibility you have for your family, which you've taken on. And so they are, as if not more important than the responsibility you have to your organization. And so when you've got those constraints, and then you've got yourself, guess who loses? You. And you should lose, because if you aren't prepared to make those sacrifices, you shouldn't have entered into those commitments. And so in this world where, again, some people are very successful at it. I don't know how, right? They're great at running their company. They're great at providing, their family what they need, and they have all of the time for self-care and pampering and everything else they need for themselves. For me, I I enjoy a good show on Netflix. I have a, I have all sorts of things I enjoy for fun. I like having a good meal, going to a nice concert. But if push comes to shove, that's what falls off. And push comes to shove often.
We asked this question from about all of the entrepreneurs we interview, and basically none of them say that they have good work-life balance.
Especially for the young ones, they're most likely don't have family obligations and all the rest. And so there's a reason, right? I mean, look, before I had a family, when I was the first time CEO at 23, it was 100-hour weeks. It was all work. There was nothing else, right? It's actually family that, the obligation of family is a lifeline for most entrepreneurs, because spending time with family is good for the self, right? It's just that you use the responsibility anchor of the family to take care of it. But boy, when you don't have that anchor, that's where and I think that's actually the biggest unspoken advantage of being a young entrepreneur. You have a lot of disadvantages, right? You haven't seen things, you learn a lot of things for the first time, you make a bunch of mistakes, you don't have your systematic thinking developed at all. But boy, you can throw twice the energy at it than somebody at my stage of life. But I also know a bunch of young entrepreneurs who love their, ayahuasca and retreats and meditation and 10-day silent whatever. And that's a disadvantage, right? Because if you're 20 and you're spending all of your time on yourself, and you're like, oh yeah, and I'll be an entrepreneur. Now you are devoting the same amount of time to somebody who's in their late 30s or early 40s, but you don't have any of the wisdom or experience. That's a mistake if you want to be successful.
If we go back to when you were starting Minerva University, how did you convince hundreds of the most talented students to join Minerva instead of going to a legacy institution?
So it turns out that so first, of course, it was a challenge, right? And you had to position right. And we started our branding from day one as, hey, this is going to be aspirational, world's best university, and all the rest. So there were a few key elements. Element number one was social proof. It was bringing people together that, my first chair of my advisory board was Larry Summers, who was the former president of Harvard, former Treasury Secretary of the United States. And so having Larry Summers back the concept of Minerva publicly was a huge coup for me. And, our first bunch of professors and staff members were, very pedigreed and had all sorts of great background. I had a successful run as an executive, at least beforehand. So there was kind of a series of these social proofs, benchmark backing the enterprise, et cetera. So all of a sudden, it wasn't a fly by night, or and again, that was an advantage of having started Minerva after having run the third largest e-commerce network in the world, rather than doing it when I initially had the idea of fixing Penn 20 years ago, or now 30 years ago, 20 years before as an undergraduate. So there was a bunch of social proof that the folks involved in this were the right folks. But then also from a positioning perspective, again, it's very much similar to what I said before, which is every university, when you think of them without Minerva, looks very different from one another, right? And as soon as you introduce Minerva into the mix, every university in the world looks exactly the same, right? They do the same, everything is identical. And so this is a law of large numbers. If 98% of the population, right, is interested in a particular solution, but that's 99.9% of the market, you've got a huge swath of the market, 2%, right, that isn't interested in that, and you're the only alternative, right? And that ultimately was the opportunity, right? And over time, of course, we grow that sliver of interest to a bigger and bigger interest, right? Because again, now we have proof points, now we have all of the outcomes, et cetera. And so that really is the outcome.
What are the key pieces of wisdom you learned throughout your career?
But I think it is important is that your readers can look into it. Is work that was done by a professor named Richard Wiseman on the nature of luck. And he proved that luck is two things. It is observing what is in your environment and then taking action based on what you observe. There's a profound difference in life if you are looking around and then when you see opportunity, you go after it. And I think that's one good meta lesson.
We have come to the end of today's discussion, which I found extremely fruitful. On behalf of the Global Young Entrepreneur Society, Ben Nelson, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Good luck to everybody listening. Your endeavors.